"This garbage food," my daughter-in-law said, loud enough for everyone at the table to hear, and I just smiled because she had no idea what I had already done that morning. The dining room fell into a silence so complete I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock above the china cabinet. The same clock that had marked every Thanksgiving in this house for over 30 years, back when laughter filled these walls instead of this careful, suffocating quiet. I stood there for a second longer than necessary, my hands still resting on the edge of the casserole dish I had spent all morning preparing, the aroma of roasted herbs and slow-cooked turkey lingering in the air like a memory no one wanted to acknowledge anymore. Vanessa sat at the far end of the table, her posture perfect, her lips curled into a small, amused smile as if she had just made an observation about the weather rather than something meant to cut. Daniel, my son, stared down at his plate, his fork frozen midair, his shoulders slightly hunched like a man hoping to disappear into the chair beneath him. No one said a word. Not his colleagues from work, not the neighbors Vanessa had invited this year without asking me, not even little Emily, who usually filled every silence with questions and laughter. I felt the weight of every eye in the room, even the ones pretending not to look. I could have said something then. I could have defended myself, reminded them that this garbage food was the same recipe Daniel used to beg for when he was a boy, the same meal that once brought this family together year after year. But I didn't. Instead, I pulled out my chair slowly and sat down, smoothing the front of my sweater as if nothing had happened, as if my hands weren't trembling just slightly beneath the table where no one could see. The fabric felt softer than usual against my fingers, or maybe my senses were just sharper now, every detail pressing in on me all at once. Across the table, Vanessa picked up her wine glass and took a delicate sip, her eyes flicking toward me for just a fraction of a second, measuring, waiting, almost disappointed by my lack of reaction. That was her way. She thrived on responses, on discomfort, on the subtle power of shifting a room with a single sentence. I had seen it before, though never quite like this, never so openly, never in front of so many people. The chandelier above us cast a warm, golden light over the table, illuminating the polished silverware, the carefully arranged centerpieces, the plates I had once set with pride. Now they looked like props in a performance I hadn't agreed to join. I reached for my glass of water and took a small sip, letting the coolness steady me, letting the moment pass over me like a wave instead of crashing through me. Because the truth was, this moment, as sharp as it felt, wasn't the beginning of anything. It was simply the first time she had chosen not to hide it. And as I sat there, listening to the quiet murmur of conversation slowly resume around me, I realized something with a clarity that surprised even me. They thought this was the moment I would break. They thought this was where I would shrink, apologize, retreat. I lowered my gaze to my plate, then back up again, meeting Vanessa's eyes just briefly before looking away, my expression calm, almost absent. Let them think that. Let them believe they understood exactly who I was and what I was worth. Because by the time this dinner was over, the only thing more surprising than her words would be what came next. I focused on my plate as the conversation slowly stitched itself back together around me. The sound of forced laughter and clinking silverware filling the cracks where something had just broken, and I could feel it in the way people avoided looking in my direction for too long, as if acknowledging me might pull them into something uncomfortable they did not want to face. And across from me, Vanessa had already moved on, casually discussing a recent weekend trip as though her words from moments ago had never existed, her voice light and effortless, practiced in the art of shifting attention, while Daniel nodded along beside her, adding small comments when necessary, his tone neutral, careful, the same way he used to speak when he was a teenager trying not to upset anyone. And I watched him for a moment, really watched him. Noticing how easily he had slipped into silence when it mattered, how natural it seemed for him now to let things pass if it kept the peace at the table. And that realization settled somewhere deep inside me, heavier than I expected, not sharp like Vanessa's words but slow and steady, like something that had been building for years without me fully seeing it. And I picked up my fork and took a small bite, chewing slowly, tasting almost nothing, though I knew exactly how this dish was supposed to taste because I had made it the same way every November since Daniel was 10 years old, back when he would stand on a chair beside me in the kitchen asking questions about every step, insisting on stirring even when he made a mess. Back when this meal meant something more than just food on a table, and I set the fork down again, my appetite gone but my posture unchanged. Because if there was one thing I understood now, it was that reactions were currency in this room, and I was no longer willing to spend mine so easily. And as the minutes passed, I let myself observe instead, noticing the way Vanessa subtly directed the conversation, steering it away from anything that might circle back to me. How she interrupted gently but firmly when someone asked a question that lingered too close. How she smiled just a second longer than necessary when people laughed, as if reinforcing her place at the center of everything. And it was not sudden, this understanding, but rather a quiet confirmation of something I had felt for a long time, something I had dismissed as imagination or sensitivity, but sitting there now, surrounded by people who once felt like family and now felt like guests in a house I no longer recognized. It became impossible to ignore, and I glanced around the dining room, at the walls I had painted myself years ago, at the cabinet that held dishes collected over decades, at the framed photos of holidays past where I stood in the middle of every picture, and I realized how little of that remained in the present moment, not because it had disappeared, but because it had been replaced, piece by piece, decision by decision, until I was no longer the one shaping what happened here. And the thought did not make me angry the way it might have before. It made me clear in a way that cut through the noise of the evening and settled everything into place. And I reached for my water again, taking another measured sip, letting the calm spread through me. Because earlier that morning, while the house had still been quiet and the day had not yet unfolded, I had already taken steps that could not be undone. Steps that no one at this table knew about. And as I set the glass back down and listened to Vanessa laugh at something someone said, I understood that this dinner, this moment, was not the peak of anything. It was simply the point where everything finally revealed itself. And for the first time in a very long time, I was not wondering what I should do next. I already knew. By the time the main course was cleared, the rhythm of the evening had settled into something almost convincing. As if nothing unusual had happened, as if the earlier moment had been quietly erased by polite conversation and refilled glasses, and I watched as plates were gathered and carried into the kitchen by hands that moved with a familiarity that used to belong to me. Noticing how naturally Vanessa directed where everything should go, which dishes stayed, which ones disappeared, how she gave instructions without raising her voice, and how everyone followed them without question. And I remained seated for a few seconds longer before standing up slowly. Not because I needed to help, but because I wanted to see it more clearly, to confirm what I already knew. And when I stepped into the kitchen, the air felt different there, warmer, filled with the scent of cinnamon and roasted vegetables, but also something else, something controlled. And Vanessa was already at the counter, organizing plates with precise movements, her back straight, her hair falling perfectly into place as if she had prepared for this moment long before anyone arrived. And she glanced at me briefly over her shoulder, her expression neutral, almost polite, but there was a flicker of something beneath it, something that acknowledged what had happened earlier without needing to repeat it. And I moved to the sink, turning on the faucet and letting the water run over my hands, the sound steady and grounding. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence between us heavier than any words could have been. And then she said, without looking directly at me, that next year she was thinking of doing something different, something more modern, maybe catering instead of cooking, something lighter, cleaner, and I nodded slightly, as if considering her suggestion, as if this were a normal conversation between two people sharing responsibility. And I dried my hands carefully, folding the towel back over the rack the way I always had, noticing how small the gesture felt now in a space that no longer belonged to me in the way it once did. And I thought about the mornings I used to spend here, planning menus, making lists, calling Daniel to ask what he wanted me to prepare, back when he still had preferences, back when he still cared enough to answer with enthusiasm instead of a distracted shrug. And I turned slightly, leaning against the counter, watching as Vanessa arranged the dessert plates, her movements efficient, practiced, and I realized that she was not improvising her role. She had built it, step by step, until it fit her perfectly, and I had allowed it, not all at once, but gradually, each time choosing peace over confrontation, each time telling myself it was not worth the tension. And now here we were, standing in the same kitchen but occupying Entirely different positions, and the clarity of that thought did not sting the way it might have before. It settled into place like something that had finally been named. And from the dining room, I could hear Daniel's voice rising slightly as he laughed at something. The sound familiar yet distant, and I wondered, not for the first time, when that shift had happened, when his laughter had stopped including me, when his attention had begun to orbit entirely around the life he had built with her. And I straightened up, smoothing my sweater again out of habit. And as Vanessa carried the dessert plates past me, she paused just long enough to say that she would handle everything from here, that I should go. Sit down and relax. Her tone gentle but firm, leaving no room for interpretation, and I gave a small nod, turning toward the doorway without protest, because there was no need for one, not anymore. And as I stepped back into the dining room, I caught my reflection briefly in the darkened window, a faint image layered over the warm light behind me. And for a second, I saw both versions at once. The woman who used to stand at the center of this room, and the one who now moved quietly along its edges. And instead of feeling diminished, I felt something else entirely, something steadier, something that did not depend on their recognition or approval. And I returned to my seat, folding my hands in my lap, listening as dessert was served and conversations continued. And beneath it all, beneath the noise and the carefully maintained normalcy, there was a quiet certainty growing stronger with every passing minute. Because earlier that day I had already made my choice, and nothing that happened in this room tonight could change it. The dessert was served on the same plates I had once reserved for special occasions, the delicate white porcelain with a thin gold rim that I used to polish by hand every year, and I watched as slices of pumpkin pie were passed around the table, each portion neat and identical, each plate placed carefully in front of guests who thanked Vanessa with warm smiles. And I noticed how easily gratitude flowed in her direction now, how natural it seemed for everyone to associate this evening with her effort, her planning, her presence, as though the years before had quietly folded into something distant and irrelevant. And I accepted my plate with a small nod, the fork resting beside it untouched for a moment as I listened to the conversation drift from travel plans to business updates, topics that moved quickly and lightly across the surface of things, never settling anywhere too deep. And I realized that I was no longer part of these exchanges, not because I could not join them, but because there was no space left for me within them. And that absence felt less like exclusion now and more like confirmation, as if the room itself had finally revealed its true shape. And I sat back slightly in my chair, observing instead of participating, noticing the way Daniel leaned closer to Vanessa when she spoke, the way he glanced at her before responding to others, as though calibrating his reactions to match hers. And it was subtle, almost invisible if you were not looking for it. But once seen, it was impossible to unsee. And I thought about the first time I had noticed that shift, months ago, maybe longer, when he had started deferring small decisions to her, things that used to come naturally to him. And I had dismissed it then as part of marriage, as a sign of partnership. But sitting here now, I understood that it had been something else entirely, something gradual and deliberate, a quiet reordering of priorities that had placed me further and further from the center until I no longer occupied any space at all. And I picked up my fork and took a small bite of the pie, the sweetness settling on my tongue without bringing any comfort. And across the table Vanessa was laughing again, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm as she spoke, her voice carrying just enough to keep everyone engaged. And I watched the ease with which she held their attention, the confidence in her posture, the certainty that she belonged exactly where she was, and I felt no urge to challenge it, no need to interrupt or reclaim anything, because the truth was, what she had taken was something I had already begun to release, piece by piece, long before this evening. And that realization did not come with regret. It came with a kind of clarity that settled over me like a calm after a long storm. And I set my fork down again, folding my hands in my lap as I listened to the hum of conversation, letting it pass through me without attachment. And I thought about the morning, about the quiet drive across town, about the office with its clean lines and steady lighting, about the conversation I had had there, measured and precise, about the documents that had been reviewed and signed, about the decisions that had been put into motion while this house was still silent and unaware. And I felt a small, steady sense of certainty take root beneath everything else, because for the first time in a long time, my next steps did not depend on anyone at this table. And as I lifted my gaze and looked around the room once more, taking in the faces, the laughter, the carefully maintained warmth of an evening that no longer included me, I understood that nothing here needed to change in order for my life to move forward, and that thought, simple as it was, carried more weight than anything that had been said all night, and I sat there quietly, present but no longer invested, knowing that what mattered most had already been decided long before dessert was ever served. As the plates were slowly cleared and the last crumbs of dessert disappeared from the table, the evening began to loosen its form, conversations breaking into smaller clusters, chairs shifting slightly as people leaned toward one another, and I remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, watching it all unfold with a quiet detachment that felt unfamiliar and yet strangely steady. And then I rose, gathering my napkin with a careful fold before placing it beside my plate, a habit I had never quite let go of, even now. And I carried my dish into the kitchen where the sink was already filling with warm water, the faint scent of soap mixing with the lingering aroma of the meal, and I set the plate down gently, not rushing, not hesitating, simply moving through the motions as I had done countless times before, though this time felt different in a way I could not ignore. And behind me, I could hear Vanessa's voice again, closer now, directing someone to stack the remaining dishes a certain way, suggesting how leftovers should be stored, her tone calm and efficient, as if she had always been the one managing this space. And I turned slightly, watching her for a brief moment, noticing how easily she occupied the center of attention even here, in the quiet aftermath of the evening, and I realized that what I had once seen as small adjustments over time had, in fact, been a complete shift, one that had happened so gradually I had almost missed it entirely, and I dried my hands on a towel, folding it neatly before placing it back where it belonged. And as I did, I remembered another evening, years ago, when this same kitchen had been filled with laughter, when Daniel had stood beside me carving turkey for the first time, his hands unsure but determined, asking if he was doing it right, and I had guided him patiently, proud of the man he was becoming, believing that the traditions we shared would carry forward naturally, without needing to be defended or protected. And I allowed that memory to pass through me without holding on to it, because it no longer belonged to the present moment, and I stepped back from the sink, giving space to the others moving around me. And Vanessa glanced at me again, offering a polite smile this time, one that did not reach her eyes, before returning to her conversation, and I nodded slightly in response, not out of obligation but out of acknowledgement, because I understood now that this dynamic, this arrangement, was not accidental. It was intentional, built through choices made over time, including my own. And I moved toward the doorway, pausing just briefly as I looked back at the kitchen, at the countertops I had wiped down countless nights, at the cabinets I had organized so many times, at the small details that once defined my role here. And I felt no urge to reclaim any of it, no need to assert myself or correct what had been allowed to shift, because earlier that morning, in a quiet office across town, I had already begun to redraw the boundaries of my life, and those boundaries no longer depended on this space or the people within it. And I stepped back into the living room where the conversations had softened into a low hum, the kind that comes at the end of a long gathering, and I took a seat near the window, folding my hands in my lap once more, watching as the evening continued without me at its center, and for the first time, I did not feel like I was being pushed out of something. I felt like I was stepping away from it on my own terms, and that distinction, subtle as it was, changed everything. And as I sat there quietly, listening without engaging, I knew that what had been set in motion earlier that day would soon make itself known, not with noise or confrontation, but with a clarity that no one in this room was expecting. And I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible breath, steady and controlled, because I was no longer waiting for anything to happen. I had already made sure that it would. The night began to settle into its final shape as guests started gathering their coats and exchanging polite goodbyes, the kind that carried just enough warmth to feel sincere without lingering too long. And I remained seated near the window, watching as each person made their way toward the door, thanking Vanessa again for hosting, complimenting the evening, the food, the atmosphere, and I noticed how naturally those words came to them, how easily they aligned themselves with the version of the night she had curated, and Daniel stood beside her, one hand resting lightly at the small of her back, nodding along, adding a quiet agreement here and there, his presence steady but secondary, and I wondered, briefly, if he even realized how much had shifted, how completely the center of gravity in this house had moved. And as the last guest stepped out into the cool evening air, the front door closing with a soft, final sound, the house seemed to exhale, the carefully maintained performance dissolving into something quieter, more honest, and for a moment there was silence, not the strained kind from earlier, but a natural pause, the kind that follows the end of something. And I stood then, slowly, smoothing my sweater once more as I walked toward the living room where Daniel and Vanessa were beginning to gather a few stray items, and neither of them looked up immediately, both still moving within the rhythm of their tasks, and I stopped a few feet away, not intruding, not announcing myself, simply present, and after a moment Daniel glanced in my direction, his expression softening just slightly, as if he had remembered something he had meant to say earlier but had not found the right time for, and he asked if everything was all right, his voice careful, measured, and I held his gaze for a brief second before nodding, offering a small, composed smile that revealed nothing beyond its surface. And I told him that everything was fine, that the evening had been lovely, and the words came out easily, without strain, because in a way they were true, just not in the way he might have understood. And Vanessa turned then, her eyes flicking between us, her expression unreadable for a moment before settling back into that same composed neutrality she carried so well, and she added that they had tried to make everything nice, that they hoped I had enjoyed myself, and I nodded again, acknowledging her effort without elaboration, because there was nothing left to clarify, nothing left to negotiate, and the silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was simply empty of anything that needed to be said, and I reached for my coat, lifting it from the back of the chair where I had placed it earlier, the fabric cool against my hands, and as I slipped it on, I felt a quiet sense of completion settle over me, not of the evening, but of something larger, something that had been unfolding long before tonight. And Daniel stepped closer, asking if I needed help with anything, if I would be staying a little longer, and I shook my head gently, telling him that I had an early morning ahead, that I should be getting home, and he nodded, accepting the answer without pressing further, and Vanessa moved toward the door, opening it for me with a polite gesture, her posture as composed as ever, and I paused just briefly at the threshold, glancing back into the house, at the warm lights, the familiar furniture, the life that had once felt entirely mine, and I realized that I was not leaving something behind. I was simply moving forward without it, and that distinction carried a quiet strength I had not expected, and I stepped outside into the crisp night air, the cool breeze brushing against my face, grounding me in the present moment, and as the door closed gently behind me, I felt no hesitation, no second thoughts, only a steady certainty that what I had set in motion earlier that day would soon reshape everything in ways they had not yet begun to imagine. And as I walked toward my car, the sound of my footsteps soft against the pavement, I allowed myself a small, private acknowledgement of that truth, because for the first time in a very long time, I was no longer reacting to what had been done to me. I was moving according to what I had chosen for myself. The drive home was quiet, the kind of quiet that does not press in on you but instead stretches out in front of you like an open road, and I kept my hands steady on the steering wheel, the glow of streetlights passing rhythmically across the windshield as I moved through familiar streets that felt slightly different now, not because they had changed, but because I had, and I did not turn on the radio, did not fill the silence with anything unnecessary, because for the first time in a long while, I did not need distraction to steady my thoughts, and when I pulled into my driveway, the house stood exactly as I had left it that morning, still and waiting, the porch light casting a soft circle onto the steps, and I sat in the car for a moment before stepping out, letting the cool air settle around me again, grounding me in the present, and as I walked up to the front door and unlocked it, the quiet inside greeted me like something familiar and honest, something that had not been reshaped or redefined by anyone else's expectations, and I closed the door behind me gently, setting my keys down on the small table by the entryway, the sound echoing softly in the stillness, and I moved through the house without turning on more lights than I needed, each room holding its place exactly as it always had, untouched, unchanged, and I paused briefly in the living room, my gaze resting on the photographs arranged along the shelf. Images from years past where smiles came easily and nothing felt forced, and I did not linger there long, because I was not looking for what had been. I was acknowledging what was, and I made my way into the kitchen, setting a glass of water on the counter, the simple motion grounding me further. And as I leaned lightly against the edge of the counter, I let the events of the evening settle into place, not replaying them with emotion, not dissecting every word, but seeing them clearly for what they were, a confirmation, not a surprise, and I thought back to the office I had visited that morning. The quiet professionalism of the space, the way the attorney had listened without interruption, the documents laid out neatly across the desk, each one representing a decision I had taken time to consider, and I remembered the moment I had signed my name, steady and certain, knowing exactly what it meant, not just legally, but personally, and I pushed away from the counter then, walking toward the small desk near the window where a folder now rested, placed there earlier in the day, its contents organized, final, and I did not open it, because I did not need to. Everything inside it was already clear in my mind, and instead I turned off the light and moved toward the hallway, the quiet of the house wrapping around me in a way that felt grounding rather than empty. And as I prepared for bed, moving through familiar routines, I noticed how steady I felt, how unchanged my breathing was, how absent the usual weight of second-guessing had become, and when I finally lay down, the room dark and still, I did not replay the dinner, did not wonder what I should have said or done differently, because that part of the story was no longer mine to manage, and as I closed my eyes, there was only one thought that remained, not loud, not urgent, but steady and certain, that by the time the next conversation happened, nothing would be the same, and for once, that change was not something to fear. It was something I had already chosen. The morning arrived without urgency, the pale light of early day slipping quietly through the curtains as I moved through my routine with the same steady pace, making coffee, setting a single cup on the counter, the familiar motions grounding me in a way that felt different now, not repetitive but deliberate. And as the coffee brewed, I glanced toward the folder resting on the desk near the window, its presence calm and unchanged, waiting, not demanding attention, and I let it remain there for a moment longer, allowing the quiet of the house to settle fully before I reached for it, my steps unhurried, my hands steady as I lifted it and carried it back to the kitchen table, placing it down carefully as I sat, and I opened it then, not because I needed to review its contents, but because I wanted to acknowledge them again, each document precisely arranged, each signature clear, each detail reflecting decisions that had not been made in haste, and I turned a page slowly, reading a line here and there, recognizing the language not just as legal structure, but as a translation of something deeper, something that had taken time to understand. And I remembered the conversation from the day before, the attorney's calm voice explaining each step, each implication, making sure there was no confusion, no uncertainty, and I had listened without interruption, asking only a few questions, not out of doubt but out of clarity, because by that point there was nothing left to reconsider, and I closed the folder gently, resting my hand on top of it for a moment, feeling the quiet weight of what had been set into motion, and I took a sip of my coffee, the warmth settling into me, steady and grounding, and outside the window the street moved as it always did, neighbors beginning their day, cars passing at a measured pace, nothing out of place, nothing announcing that anything had changed, and that was the part one understood most clearly now. Change did not always arrive with noise or disruption. Sometimes it moved quietly, taking shape beneath the surface until it was already complete, and I stood then, carrying the folder to the small desk and placing it back in its place, not hiding it, not displaying it, simply letting it exist as part of what came next, and I moved through the rest of the morning with the same calm focus, tidying the kitchen, folding a blanket in the living room, pausing only briefly when my phone buzzed on the counter, the screen lighting up with Daniel's name, and I looked at it for a moment before picking it up, not with hesitation but with intention, and when I answered, his voice carried a familiar tone, careful, measured, asking if I had gotten home safely, if everything had been all right, and I told him that I had, that the drive had been quiet, that I was already moving through my day, and there was a pause on the other end, as if he were considering something more, something unsaid, but he did not push further, and I did not offer anything beyond what I had already given. And when the call ended, I set the phone back down without lingering, without analyzing what had not been said, because I understood now that clarity did not require explanation. And as I stepped back from the counter and looked around the room, I felt the same steady certainty from the night before, not stronger, not weaker, simply present. Because what mattered was not how they would respond or what they would realize. What mattered was that the direction of my life had already shifted, and as the morning continued, unfolding in its quiet, ordinary way, I moved forward with it, not waiting for anything to happen, because everything that needed to begin already had. By the afternoon, the quiet of the house had settled into something steady and complete, the kind of stillness that does not ask anything of you. And I moved through it with a sense of clarity that had not been there before, each step deliberate, each decision already made. And when the phone rang again, I did not rush to answer it. I let it ring once, twice, before picking it up, recognizing the number immediately. And this time Vanessa's voice came through, smooth and composed as always, asking if I had a moment to talk, her tone polite, almost careful, as though she were stepping into unfamiliar ground. And I told her that I did, that I was home, that I was listening. And there was a brief pause on her end before she continued, mentioning the evening before in a way that avoided specifics, saying that things might have come across differently than intended, that the atmosphere had been busy, that sometimes words did not land the way people expect. And I listened without interrupting, without filling the silence, letting her speak until she reached the end of what she had prepared to say. And when she finished, I responded simply, telling her that I understood, that gatherings could be overwhelming, that not everything needed to be revisited, and my voice remained even, calm, offering neither agreement nor resistance. And she seemed to hesitate then, as if waiting for something more, something emotional, something that would confirm the balance she was used to maintaining, but I did not provide it. And after a moment she shifted the conversation, asking about the upcoming weeks, about plans, about whether I would be coming by again soon, and I paused for just a second before answering, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted the words to land exactly where they needed to. And I told her that my schedule would be changing, that I had already begun making new arrangements, that I would not be available in the same way moving forward. And the quiet on the other end of the line stretched just slightly longer this time. And when she spoke again, there was a different tone beneath her words, something more attentive, more aware, asking what I meant by that. And I explained, calmly and without detail, that I had made some decisions regarding my time, my responsibilities, and my assets, that everything had been reviewed and finalized, that there was no immediate concern, but that certain expectations would need to adjust. And I did not elaborate further, because I did not need to, and she did not ask again, not directly, but I could hear the shift in her breathing, the subtle recalibration happening in real time. And when the call ended, it did so politely, without tension, without confrontation, but not without consequence. And I set the phone down once more, the room returning to its quiet state as if nothing had interrupted it. And I stood there for a moment, looking out the window at the street beyond, the steady movement of the day continuing as it always did, and I realized that the change had already begun, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly. And as I turned away from the window and moved back into the rhythm of my day, I felt no need to check, no need to confirm what they would think or how they would respond, because that part no longer belonged to me, and what remained was simple, steady, and entirely my own. And as the light shifted slowly across the room, marking the passage of time in its quiet way, I understood that the next time we all sat at the same table, it would not be the same table at all, not in the ways that truly mattered, and this time, I would not be the one adjusting to fit into it. I would be the one who had already chosen where I belonged.